The whip cracked through the humid Alabama air like thunder announcing a storm, and every enslaved person gathered in the yard of the Wallace plantation held their breath, waiting for the scream that always came. Overseer Jones stood there with his arm raised, sweat already staining the armpits of his shirt despite the early morning hour. His face twisted with that particular expression of eager cruelty that had become his signature over 15 years of wielding authority over black bodies. The leather whip in his hand, 9 feet of braided cowhide that he kept oiled and supple specifically for this purpose, hung for just a moment at the apex of its arc, a promise of pain suspended in time. And then it fell, striking across my back with a sound like a pistol shot, tearing through the thin cotton of my workshirt and biting deep into flesh that had known pain before, but never quite like this, never in this context, never with this particular meaning. The impact drove the air from my lungs, sent fire racing along every nerve, made my vision blur and my knees want to buckle against the post they'd tied me to, but I didn't scream. Instead, I turned my head as far as the ropes binding my wrists to the whipping post would allow, looked directly at Overseer Jones, looked him straight in his cruel, watery blue eyes that had watched so many people suffer and had never shown a moment of mercy or doubt, and I smiled. Not a grimace of pain disguised as defiance, not the rictus of someone losing their mind under torture, not the broken smile of someone trying to rob their tormentor of satisfaction, but a genuine, calm, knowing smile that said clearly, "You think you're punishing me, but you have no idea what's really happening here. You think you have power, but in 12 hours, you'll understand how powerless you've actually been all along. You think you're making an example of me, but I'm making history, and you're just a footnote in a story about freedom that you'll never understand." Jones's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear flickering at the edges. He'd been an overseer for 15 years across 3 different plantations, had whipped hundreds of enslaved people in that time, had seen every reaction the human body and mind could produce under such circumstances. He'd seen people scream and beg. He'd seen people curse him and garden everyone. He'd seen silent stoicism, where people bit through their own lips to avoid giving him the satisfaction of their pain. He'd seen people pray and people break, and people try to maintain dignity in the face of deliberate humiliation. But he'd never, not once in 15 years, seen someone smile at him like they knew a secret that would destroy him, like they were counting down to something wonderful that he couldn't see or prevent, like his power was already broken, even as he stood there holding the instrument of torture. It unsettled him in a way that no amount of resistance or defiance had ever managed, because defiance he understood. Defiance was predictable, was part of the natural dynamic between enslaver and enslaved, was something he could respond to with additional force and increased brutality. But this calm, knowing smile that suggested his entire world was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. He had no framework for understanding it, no script for responding to it. So he did what men like him always do when confronted with something they don't understand. He applied more violence, as if enough pain could force the situation back into familiar patterns. The second strike came harder than the first, Jones putting his full weight behind it, the whip wrapping partially around my torso to bite into my side as well as my back. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot line of agony that made every muscle in my body want to convulse, that sent my vision gray at the edges. That made breathing feel like an impossible task. Blood was beginning to flow now, soaking through my torn shirt, running down my back in warm rivulets that I could feel but couldn't see. But I'd been preparing for this moment for over a year. I'd known this day would come, had known that the final phase of the plan would require me to endure public punishment without breaking, without revealing anything that might compromise what was about to happen. And I'd spent months strengthening myself mentally for it, had practiced in my mind the art of separating my consciousness from my body, of finding a place deep inside myself where pain couldn't reach the essential core of who I was, of maintaining clarity and purpose even as my flesh was being destroyed. My mother had taught me this skill when I was young, though in a different context. She'd been a midwife before arthritis had crippled her hands, and she'd attended births where the laboring women needed to find that place beyond pain to successfully bring children into the world. "Your body will hurt, baby," she told me when I was barely 10 years old, already understanding that pain was an inevitable part of being enslaved. Can't avoid that, but your mind, your spirit, yourself, that can go somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere they can't touch. You learn to do that. You survive things that would break other people. So as Jones struck me again and again, I went to that place my mother had taught me about. I felt the pain. I couldn't avoid that, but I didn't let it overwhelm the certainty that lived at my core. The certainty that I'd done the work, made the plans, coordinated with 33 people across 13 months of careful preparation. The certainty that tonight, just a few hours from now, we would all walk away from slavery and toward freedom. The certainty that this whipping, terrible as it was just the final signal that everyone had been waiting for. And I smiled again, wider this time. And I said quietly enough that only Jones and the people closest to the whipping post could hear, my voice steady despite the pain. "Is that all you have?" The words hit Jones harder than any physical blow could have. I watched his face go pale beneath his perpetual sunburn, watched his hand shake slightly on the whip handle, watched him take an involuntary step backward, as if I'd threatened him, rather than simply asking a question. Around the yard, I could see the reaction rippling through the assembled enslaved people. Confusion from most because they didn't understand what I was doing or why I would provoke additional punishment. But recognition from the 33 who knew. The 33 who'd been part of the plan from the beginning. The 33 who understood that my smile wasn't madness or supernatural defiance or even just personal courage in the face of suffering. It was signal. Pure, simple, unmistakable signal that meant today, tonight, freedom. Everything we've worked for is about to happen. My name is Esther, and I'm 30 years old. I was born enslaved on the Wallace cotton plantation in central Alabama in 1827, the daughter of parents who'd been born here themselves, creating a lineage of bondage that stretched back to my grandparents who'd been brought here in the early 1790s, when the plantation was first being established. I'd spent 30 years learning to appear exactly what white people expected. A field worker, strong and reliable but not remarkable, someone who did her assigned labor efficiently and kept her head down and seemed to accept her condition without question or hope of change. I'd cultivated that appearance deliberately and with great care, because I'd learned early from watching other enslaved people that those who drew attention through exceptional strength or intelligence or beauty or defiance were the ones who suffered most. The strongest men were worked to death in the fields. The most intelligent were viewed with suspicion and either sold away or given dangerous tasks designed to break their spirit. The beautiful women were sexually exploited by masters and overseers. The defiant were beaten, tortured, sometimes killed as examples to others. But the ones who seemed ordinary, they were overlooked, dismissed, assumed to be simple and controllable and safe. They could move through the plantation relatively unnoticed, could observe without being observed, could build networks and gather information, while everyone's attention was focused on the people who seemed more dangerous or valuable. So I'd made myself ordinary. I picked cotton at a steady, reliable pace, not so fast that I'd be pushed to maintain impossible standards, not so slow that I'd be punished. Just exactly average in a way that made overseers' eyes slide past me when they were looking for people to single out for either reward or punishment. I was polite, but not effusive, obedient, but not eager, strong enough to be useful, but not so strong that I'd be assigned the hardest labor. I was, to all external appearances, exactly the kind of enslaved person that plantation owners wanted, productive, manageable, apparently content with her lot. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, I was something very different. I was my grandmother's heir, carrier of knowledge that went back generations, student of systems of resistance that had been refined over centuries of African and African-American experience with oppression and survival. My grandmother, Abena, had been brought from West Africa as a child in the late 1780s. She'd been Akan, from what's now called Ghana, and she'd carried with her the cultural knowledge of her people, including sophisticated systems of communication through textiles. In Akan culture, cloth wasn't just decorative or functional, it was a language, Specific patterns, colors, and designs carried meanings, told stories, conveyed complex information to those who knew how to read them. When Abina had been forced to work in the fields of the Wallace plantation, she'd eventually been given permission to make quilts. Her captors saw it as harmless women's work, a way to keep enslaved people occupied during evening hours, to create bedding that would keep workers healthy enough to labor. They had no idea they were allowing the preservation and evolution of a communication system that would eventually be used to coordinate one of the most successful mass escapes in Alabama history. Abina had taught her daughter, my mother, Sarah, how to read and create the patterns. Not just the beautiful designs that white people saw and occasionally praised, but the hidden meanings embedded within them. The North Star pattern that pointed to freedom, the wagon wheel that meant prepare to travel, the log cabin that indicated safe houses, the crossroads that showed decision points on escape routes, the flying geese that indicated directional guidance, the bow tie that meant dress in disguise, adopt different identity. And my mother had taught me, not just the quilt patterns, but the philosophy behind them. That resistance doesn't always look like rebellion, that the most powerful weapons are sometimes the ones your enemies don't recognize as weapons, that patience and planning can achieve what violence and desperate action cannot. White people think we're simple, my mother had told me when I was perhaps 8 years old enough to understand complexity and young enough to still be receiving direct instruction rather than just modeling. They see us work in the fields, hear us talk simple when they're listening, watch us pray to their God, and they think that's all we are. They don't see the layers beneath. They don't understand that we're playing roles, showing them what they expect to see while keeping our real selves hidden and safe. She'd shown me a quilt she was working on, a beautiful pattern in blues and whites that any white person would see as simply decorative. "What does this say?" she'd asked me. I'd studied it carefully, identifying the patterns she'd taught me to recognize. North Star for navigation, wagon wheel for journey, crossroads for decision point, bow tie for disguise. It's instructions for escape. "Not for now," she'd said. "Maybe not ever for me. I'm too old, too worn out from bearing 9 children and losing 6 of them. But someday, maybe for you or your children, these patterns might mean freedom. And if that day comes, you'll need to know how to read them and how to make them, how to pass information that looks like decoration, how to coordinate action that looks like simple daily life." I'd learned, not just quilts, but other systems of communication that various people in our community had developed or preserved from African traditions. Old Samuel, who'd been a griot in his youth before being captured and enslaved, taught me about using natural markers, tree carvings, stone arrangements, broken branches, to leave messages and directional indicators in forests and fields. Ruth, who'd been a rope maker, showed me how knots tied in specific sequences could convey complex information about timing, numbers, and distances. My husband Isaiah, who had a natural gift for music and memory, taught me how spirituals could carry coded information, how the lyrics that seemed to be only about religious longing actually contained practical instructions for escape. And I'd taken all these separate threads of knowledge and woven them together into something more comprehensive than any single system, something redundant and layered and sophisticated enough to coordinate complex action across a large group while remaining invisible to those who didn't know how to read the signs. The planning for what would eventually become the escape of 33 people had begun in earnest in July of 1856, 13 months before that morning, when Jones whipped me in front of the assembled enslaved community. The trigger had been the sale of my oldest child, a daughter named Hannah, who was 10 years old and beautiful and intelligent, and exactly the kind of child that plantation owners sold for high prices to other wealthy families looking for house servants they could train. Wallace had sold Hannah to a family in Georgia without warning, without negotiation, without caring that he was tearing a child from her mother's arms. One morning she was there, helping me in the cabin before we went to the fields. By afternoon she was gone, sold and transported before I even knew what was happening. I'd stood in that empty cabin that evening, held by Isaiah, who was weeping as hard as I was, and I'd felt something crystallize inside me. I couldn't save Hannah. She was gone, and the distance and the law meant I'd probably never see her again. but I could make sure no one else I loved was taken from me. I could ensure that my remaining children, Caleb and Sarah, grew up free. I could save as many people as possible from the daily cruelty and the constant threat of family separation that defined enslaved life. And I could punish Wallace and Jones and the entire system they represented by taking away their most valuable asset, the labor they'd stolen, the people they'd reduced to property, the human beings whose stolen lives funded their wealth and status. That night, I'd begun to plan. Not a desperate, impulsive escape attempt that would likely fail and result in death or worse, but a careful, methodical, long-term operation that would maximize the number of people who achieved freedom while minimizing the risk of capture or betrayal. The first step had been recruitment. I needed to identify people who could be trusted absolutely, who wanted freedom enough to take extraordinary risks, who had the discipline to maintain security for months while we prepared, and who brought useful skills or knowledge to the group. I needed a mix of ages and capabilities, young people who could handle the physical demands of a long march, older people with experience and wisdom, families with children who'd be motivated by the chance to raise their kids in freedom. If you're following Esther's transformation from grieving mother to freedom architect, take a moment to drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe to uncover more stories of intelligence, organization, and strategic resistance from those who fought slavery with planning rather than violence. I spent 2 months just observing, saying nothing about my plans, but watching people carefully, identifying candidates. Isaiah was obvious. He was my husband, and I trusted him with my life. But I needed to be strategic about everyone else because one person who couldn't be trusted, one person who broke under pressure or got drunk and talked, one person who decided to betray the group for a reward, could destroy everything and get everyone killed. I looked for people who'd lost family to sales because that grief made them desperate enough to risk everything. I looked for people who'd been at the plantation for years, who understood the rhythms and patterns, who wouldn't panic in unexpected situations. I looked for people with specialized knowledge. Samuel knew forests and tracking. Miriam understood which plants were edible or medicinal. Thomas could navigate by stars. Ruth could handle horses if we needed them. By September of 1856, I'd identified 17 potential recruits beyond Isaiah and myself. I approached them carefully, individually, in situations where we couldn't be overheard or observed. Sometimes it was while working side by side in the fields, our voices lost in the general sound of labor. Sometimes it was during the brief evening hours in the quarters, conversations that looked like casual gossip, but that conveyed much more important information. Sometimes it was through intermediaries. Isaiah would approach someone I'd identified, feel them out, determine if they could be trusted before I ever directly contacted them. The approach was always the same, a careful feeling out of their mindset, their desire for freedom, their willingness to risk everything, never revealing the full plan initially, just gauging whether they could handle the knowledge, whether they'd maintain security, whether they truly wanted what I was offering enough to accept the dangers that came with it. If you could be free, I'd ask, seemingly hypothetically, if there was a way to walk away from here and make it to Canada, would you take it, even knowing that if you're caught, you'd likely be sold south to the sugar plantations where life expectancy is 2 years, even knowing that the journey would be hard and dangerous and that you might not make it? Some people said no. The risk was too great, the unknown too terrifying, the comfort of familiar suffering preferable to the dangers of attempted freedom. I respected that decision and never approached them again, never revealed that there was anything beyond a hypothetical question. But others, those who had fire still burning inside them despite years of oppression, those who'd lost so much that they had nothing left to lose, those who couldn't imagine living the rest of their lives in bondage, they said yes, and those were the ones I began to recruit in earnest. By December of 1856, I had a core group of 19 people who knew that something was being planned and who'd committed to participating. By March of 1857, that number had grown to 31, and by June, I'd reached 33 total. The final number I'd decided on based on logistics, security, and the maximum size of group that could move efficiently while remaining coordinated. Once I had my 33, the real work began. Teaching them the communication systems, preparing them mentally and physically for the escape, gathering and caching supplies, mapping routes, making contact with the underground railroad network that could help us once we got out of immediate area. The quilt codes were the foundation of the system. I made quilts, and so did other women in the group, always working on multiple patterns simultaneously, so no single quilt would stand out as unusual. We'd hang them in specific locations, doorways, windows, lines strung between cabins, and the pattern displayed would convey information. The North Star pattern meant navigation information would be shared soon. The wagon wheel meant prepare for travel. The crossroads meant a decision point was approaching. The combination of patterns and their positioning created a complex vocabulary that could communicate timing, locations, warnings, and confirmations. But quilts alone weren't enough. They were visible and could potentially be noticed by observant overseers. So I developed complementary systems that were even more subtle. Tree markings became a language of their own. When I was gathering wood or herbs, tasks that gave me access to the forest edges, I'd carve specific patterns into bark that would be invisible unless you knew to look for them. 3 parallel cuts meant safe to proceed. A cross meant danger, avoid this area. A circle meant meeting point. The height of the marking indicated distance. Marks at waist height meant nearby. Marks at eye level meant farther away. The cardinal direction of the marking on the tree trunk indicated which way to travel. Over months, I marked a route from the Wallace plantation northward through the forest, creating a path that could be followed without maps or written directions, readable only by those I'd taught to interpret the signs. It was slow work. I could only make a few marks each time I went into the forest without attracting suspicion, and I had to make them subtle enough that casual observers wouldn't notice. But by July of 1857, I had a complete marked route covering the first 20 miles of our planned journey. Rope knots became timing indicators. Ropes were everywhere on a plantation, used for tying animals, hanging tools, bundling materials. They were so common that no one paid attention to them. But I taught my group that specific knot patterns could indicate dates and times. 3 overhand knots in sequence meant 3 days. A figure 8 knot meant evening. A bowline meant midnight. A clove hitch meant dawn. By combining knots, I could communicate precise timing information through ropes left in agreed-upon locations. A rope hanging in the barn with a specific pattern of knots could tell everyone when the escape would happen without me having to risk direct communication. Songs became vectors for coordination and morale. The spirituals we sang while working, songs that overseers heard as religious expression, and evidence that Christianity was successfully pacifying the enslaved population, carried instructions and encouragement for those who knew how to listen. Steal away to Jesus wasn't just about salvation, it was about preparing to literally steal away. Wade in the water wasn't just about baptism, it was practical advice about evading dogs by moving through streams. Follow the drinking gourd was star navigation disguised as metaphor. And I composed new verses for familiar songs, verses that specifically addressed our planned escape, that reinforced the plan and reminded people what we were working toward. By August of 1857, everything was ready. Supplies were cached at multiple points along our route, food that wouldn't spoil, water containers, warm clothes for the northern climate we'd eventually reach, basic medical supplies. I'd made contact, through intermediaries, with the Underground Railroad network and knew the location of our first safe house 30 miles north of the plantation. Everyone in the group knew the plan, knew their role, knew what to do if things went wrong. We had primary routes and backup routes, contingency plans for various problems, systems for communication if we got separated. The only question remaining was when to go. I needed the right combination of circumstances, weather that would cover our tracks and keep patrols indoors, a night when moon would provide some light for travel without being so bright we'd be easily visible, a time when plantation security was routine rather than heightened. And I needed a signal that would be unmistakable, that couldn't be confused or misinterpreted, that would tell all 33 people simultaneously that tonight was the night. The whipping provided that signal. I'd been creating opportunities for it for weeks, engaging in small acts of insubordination that would draw Jones's attention and anger without being so severe that they'd get me sold away or permanently injured. Breaking a tool accidentally, responding to orders with subtle disrespect in my tone, taking slightly longer breaks than allowed, working at slightly slower pace than normal. Nothing dramatic enough to be real rebellion, just enough to irritate Jones, to make him want to reassert his authority, to create a situation where he'd decide a public whipping was necessary to remind everyone of his power and the consequences of disobedience. And that morning in August, when I'd talked back after accidentally breaking an expensive hoe, Jones had taken the bait perfectly. He'd ordered me bound to the whipping post in the main yard, had assembled everyone to witness the punishment, had announced that I needed to be taught a lesson about obedience and respect. He had no idea he was participating in the final stage of my plan, that he was providing exactly the signal I needed, that every strike of his whip was bringing freedom closer for 33 people. The 10th strike came, and Jones was sweating heavily now, his arm trembling slightly from the exertion and from the psychological strain of my continued smile. The crowd of enslaved people watching was silent, but I could feel the tension in that silence. Most of them didn't understand what was happening, why I wasn't reacting normally, what my smile meant, but my 33 understood. They saw the signal and knew. Tonight at midnight at the oak tree, freedom. Jones stopped after that 10th strike, though he'd announced he'd give me 20. He threw down the whip and stalked away, his face twisted with confusion and anger and something that looked like fear. He muttered something about unnatural and devil woman as he walked toward the main house, leaving me tied to the post, my back a ruin of torn flesh and flowing blood. They untied me eventually, and Isaiah and Ruth half carried me back to my cabin, their hands gentle but urgent, their faces showing the strain of maintaining neutral expressions when they wanted to celebrate and weep simultaneously. In the cabin, Isaiah cleaned my wounds with hands that shook with suppressed rage, while our children watched with eyes too old and knowing for their ages. "Tonight," Isaiah whispered, his voice barely audible even in the privacy of our cabin, because walls in slave quarters were thin and you never knew who might be listening. I nodded fractionally, not trusting my voice yet, the pain of my back finally overwhelming the mental distance I'd maintained during the actual whipping. Now that I was safe and private, I could let myself feel it, could acknowledge that yes, it hurt terribly, that I'd have scars for the rest of my life, that I'd never fully recover from this physically, but in less than 12 hours I'd be free, and that made everything worth it. The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness. I tried to rest, to let my body recover as much as possible for the ordeal ahead. Around me, across the plantation, 33 people were going through their normal routines while internally preparing for the night ahead, saying silent goodbyes to people they'd have to leave behind, family members who weren't part of the plan, friends who'd chosen not to risk the escape, children too young to bring or parents too old to make the journey, checking on cached supplies in their minds, reviewing the route and timing, strengthening their resolve for what was coming. And they were doing it all while appearing completely normal, because any deviation from routine could alert the overseers that something was wrong. They picked cotton, they prepared meals, they fed animals. They moved through the rhythms of enslaved life one final time, knowing that if everything went according to plan, they'd never have to do this forced labor again. As darkness fell, I could feel the anticipation building. The rain I'd been predicting based on cloud patterns, wind direction, animal behavior, and the aching of injuries that served as weather forecasting began right on schedule. Light at first, just a sprinkle that could be ignored, but within an hour it had intensified into a proper downpour, heavy rain that reduced visibility to almost nothing and turned the plantation roads into mud that would make patrolling difficult and tracking nearly impossible. Perfect conditions. Everything was aligning exactly as I'd hoped and planned. At 11:30, I rose from my bed despite the pain radiating from my torn back. Isaiah helped me dress in the clothes we'd prepared and hidden weeks ago, sturdy pants and shirt adapted from cast-off men's clothing, thick-soled shoes we'd traded favors to obtain, rather than the thin slippers that were usually issued to enslaved women, a dark coat that would blend into the night and provide warmth when we reached colder northern climates. Our children, Caleb and Sarah, dressed similarly, moving with quiet efficiency that broke my heart because 8 and 6 was too young to have to be this serious, this frightened, this brave. At 11:45, we slipped out of our cabin into the rain-soaked darkness. The storm was so heavy that you couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, couldn't hear anything over the sound of rain hammering on wood and mud. The patrols, if they were even bothering to ride on a night like this, would be blind and miserable, and unlikely to notice 4 dark figures moving through the darkness. We moved carefully toward the first gathering point, the large oak tree at the edge of the cotton fields, the one I'd marked months ago with 3 parallel cuts on the south side. I'd communicated the location through multiple systems, a quilt pattern hanging yesterday, a rope with specific knots left in the barn, a verse in this morning's work song that referenced oak and south. When we arrived, soaked through and breathing hard from tension rather than exertion, 14 people were already there, materializing out of the rain like spirits or dreams. Silent greetings, quick checks that everyone was present and ready. Samuel with his wife and teenage son, Miriam with her 2 sisters, Thomas and his elderly father who could still walk but would need help, Marcus and Daniel, both young and strong, who'd volunteered to serve as rear guard, Ruth and her daughter Hannah, both of them skilled with horses and navigation. No talking beyond absolute essential minimum. We'd rehearsed this scenario so many times in our minds that everyone knew their role, knew the plan, knew what came next. At midnight exactly, by my internal clock that I'd calibrated over 30 years of waking at precise times for plantation work, that was within minutes of actual clock time, we moved as a group toward the northern edge of the property. Not running, because running looked like escape and made noise and drew attention. Walking with purpose, moving like people who belonged where they were, which was the most effective camouflage even in the middle of the night during a storm. We walked in careful formation through the darkness and rain, heading toward the boundary between Wallace's cultivated land and the wild forest beyond. 33 souls moving in coordinated silence toward freedom, each one carrying hope and terror and determination in equal measure, each one knowing that we were now committed, that there was no turning back, that by dawn we would either be on our way to Canada or we would be dead or recaptured. The second gathering point was a collapsed barn on the boundary between the plantation and the forest, a structure that had been abandoned years ago after partial destruction by fire. Here the second group was waiting, 19 more people who'd been working in different areas of the plantation or who'd needed to take different routes to avoid notice. 33 total, everyone present, no one caught, no one who'd chickened out at the last moment, no alarm raised. The first phase of the plan had executed perfectly. From the collapsed barn, we entered the forest proper. This was the most dangerous psychological moment, the point where we officially became runaways, where we crossed the line from enslaved people who were on plantation property to fugitives who'd made the active choice to seek freedom. If we were caught now, the punishment wouldn't be whipping or additional labor. It would be death or sale to the brutal sugar plantations of the Deep South, where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years, where overseers worked enslaved people literally to death and then simply purchased replacements. But it was also the point where our advantages began to become clear, because I'd mapped this forest over months of gathering herbs, medical plants and firewood. I'd marked trails that the patrols didn't know about, identified routes that avoided the most commonly watched areas, cached supplies at strategic points along the way. We moved through the forest in the formation I'd designed after studying every escape narrative I'd ever heard and thinking through the logistics carefully. Strong men at the front to clear obstacles and navigate, strong men at the rear to watch for pursuit and provide defense if necessary, families with children in the protected middle, those with specialized knowledge, navigation, medicine, forest skills, distributed throughout to provide redundancy if the group had to split up. We moved in near total silence, the rain covering what small sounds we made, the darkness hiding us from any eyes that might be watching. Everyone had been trained to walk carefully, to test the ground before putting full weight down, to avoid breaking branches or disturbing undergrowth in ways that would leave obvious trails. 10 miles into the forest, at a small creek I'd identified months ago, we stopped at our first cache point. Here, buried in a sealed barrel that I'd stolen piece by piece over months and assembled in secret, were supplies we'd need for the journey. dried meat and hardtack that would keep for weeks, water flasks, extra shoes in various sizes, warm clothes, basic medicines and bandages, a knife and some basic tools. I'd buried this cache 4 months ago, marking its location with specific tree carvings that only we could read, checking on it periodically to ensure it hadn't been discovered or disturbed. Now we dug it up quickly and efficiently, distributed the contents according to the plan we'd rehearsed. Everyone got food and water. Those who needed better shoes received them. Children got warmer coats. The knife went to Samuel, who had experience with wilderness survival. This was one of the critical tests of the group's discipline and cohesion. Would people cooperate and share fairly, or would fear and desperation make them selfish and competitive? But everyone behaved exactly as we'd practiced, exactly as I'd believed they would when I chose them. No fighting over resources, no hoarding, no selfishness. Just calm, efficient distribution and preparation for the next stage of the journey. By dawn, we'd covered 15 miles, deep enough into the wilderness that casual patrols wouldn't find us easily. We found the hiding spot I'd identified on previous scouting trips, a natural depression in the landscape, surrounded by thick vegetation and fallen trees that created a space where 33 people could conceal themselves almost completely from anyone passing nearby. Here we stopped, posted careful sentries, and tried to rest through the day. No fires, which meant no hot food or warmth despite being soaked through from the night's rain. No loud voices, which meant we couldn't talk about the enormity of what we'd done or encourage each other openly. Just 33 people huddled together for warmth and security, trying to sleep despite exhaustion and fear and the exhilaration of being this far, of having successfully escaped the plantation, of being on the road to freedom even if that road was long and dangerous. I couldn't sleep despite my exhaustion. My back was agony from the whipping and the night's exertion, every movement sending fresh pain through the torn flesh. But more than the physical pain, my mind was racing through contingencies, worrying about what was happening back at the plantation, wondering when they'd discover we were gone and how they'd react. The discovery came at dawn, exactly as I'd anticipated. The overseer rang the bell for morning work assembly, and 33 people didn't appear. First, there would be confusion. Had there been some miscommunication? Were people sick in their cabins? Then individual overseers would be sent to check, and they'd find the cabins empty, belongings mostly gone, clear signs of deliberate departure. Then the growing realization spreading like fire through the overseer ranks. They'd escaped. Not 1 or 2 individuals running on impulse, but 33 people moving in coordination, clearly following a plan. By mid-morning, I imagined, Wallace would know. And Jones would be starting to understand the magnitude of what had happened under his watch. Jones stood in the main yard of the Wallace plantation as the full scope of the disaster became clear, his face gone pale beneath his sunburn, his hands shaking as he held the list that his assistants had compiled. 33 names. 33 of their most valuable and capable workers, men, women, and children who'd simply vanished in the night like they'd been erased from existence. He kept returning mentally to that whipping yesterday morning, to the woman who'd smiled at him through the pain, to her unsettling calm and the sense he'd had that she knew something he didn't. And now he understood. She'd known that the escape was hours away, that his whip was meaningless, because by the time he could hurt her enough to break her will, she'd be beyond his reach forever. The smile hadn't been defiance. It had been victory, achieved before he'd even understood he was in a battle. Wallace took the news badly, his face going from red with anger to white with shock as the financial implications sank in. 33 enslaved people represented over $40,000 in capital investment. Losing them was a financial catastrophe that could bankrupt the plantation if they weren't recovered quickly. Beyond the money, it was humiliation. How had this happened? How had so many people coordinated an escape without anyone noticing? What did this say about his management, his oversight, his control? They'd sent riders immediately to alert neighboring plantations and the patrol. They'd organized search parties with dogs. They'd done everything that protocol demanded when enslaved people ran. But there was a sick feeling growing in Jones's gut, a certainty that these particular runaways weren't going to be found easily or at all. Because as the day went on, and Jones began investigating the empty cabins and talking to the enslaved people who remained, he started finding things. Strange things. Things that should have meant nothing, but that took on ominous significance in light of the mass escape. Quilts with unusual patterns, quilts that had been hanging in specific locations at specific times. Jones had never paid attention to enslaved people's quilts before. They were just decorative blankets, women's work, beneath notice. But now, looking at them with dawning suspicion, he wondered if those patterns had meaning beyond decoration, if they'd been methods of communication hiding in plain sight, marks on trees throughout the plantation and into the forest beyond. Consistent patterns of cuts and scratches that Jones had always assumed were random damage from tools or animals. But examined closely, they formed patterns that seemed deliberate, that seemed to point directions or indicate distances, or convey information he couldn't decipher. Ropes with strange knots that no one had questioned, because ropes were everywhere, and knots were just how you secured things. But some of these knots were unusual, complex, arranged in sequences that might or might not be random. The more Jones looked, the more he saw evidence of a system, a language, a network of communication that had been operating right in front of him for months or longer. And at the center of it, he became increasingly obsessed with believing had been that woman. Esther, the one who'd smiled at him during the whipping. She'd orchestrated this. He didn't know how yet, couldn't prove it, but he knew with moral certainty that the woman who'd looked at him with that knowing smile had been the architect of the largest successful escape from the Wallace plantation in its 70-year history. Meanwhile, our group was making steady progress northward. We traveled by night, rested in hidden locations during the day, moving in stages toward the first safe house I'd arranged contact with, a Quaker farm 30 miles north of the Wallace plantation. The journey was hard, the terrain difficult, the constant fear of discovery exhausting. But we were together. We were free. And every mile we put between ourselves and the plantation increased our chances of making it all the way to Canada. On the third night, we reached the Harper farm. I'd made contact with Benjamin and Rachel Harper through an intermediary months ago, had sent word that we'd be coming, though I hadn't been able to specify exact timing. They were expecting us, or at least expecting that someday a group of runaways would appear at their door seeking help. When 33 exhausted, frightened, hopeful people emerged from the forest at their farm just before dawn, the Harpers welcomed us with tears and prayer and immediate practical assistance. They fed us real food, the first proper meal we'd had in 3 days. They tended to injuries and illnesses, Rachel spending particular time on my back, which was infected and healing badly from the whipping. They provided a warm barn to sleep in, gave us current information about patrol patterns and safe routes forward, and most importantly, they gave us hope that this was possible, that people did make it to Canada, that we could succeed if we remained careful and determined. "You're the group from Wallace Plantation," Benjamin said that morning as we rested in his barn, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and concern. "Word has spread fast. They're searching hard for you. 33 people is a large group, harder to hide, easier to spot." "We won't be a group of 33 much longer," I told him, explaining the next phase of the plan. "We'll split into smaller groups for the middle stages of the journey. Harder to track, easier to hide, better chance that even if some are caught, others make it through." This was always part of the strategy I'd developed. Travel together initially, to handle any immediate close pursuit, and to provide mutual support during the most dangerous first stage. Then divide for the middle stages, where we'd be moving through areas with heavy patrol activity, and where a large group would be too visible. Then potentially regroup near the Canadian border for the final crossing, where numbers might provide advantages again. We stayed at the Harper farm for 2 days, recovering strength and finalizing plans, and it was here that I had time to truly process what we'd accomplished and what still lay ahead. We'd gotten 33 people off the Wallace plantation, without violence, without casualties, without leaving evidence that could be easily traced to a specific organizer. We'd moved 15 miles through difficult terrain in one night, found our cache, stayed hidden during a full day, and reached our first safe house. Every major element of the first phase had worked. But we were still in Alabama, Still in slave territory, still hundreds of miles from Canada and legal freedom. The hardest part was yet to come. Weeks of travel through states where we were wanted fugitives, where massive rewards would be offered for our capture, where any white person could choose to help or betray us. The group divided as planned into 6 smaller units. Isaiah and I stayed together with our children and 2 others, Marcus, a strong young man who'd volunteered as our group's protector, and Ruth, whose knowledge of horses and navigation made her invaluable. We said goodbye to the other 27, knowing we might never see them again, but trusting that we'd all given each other the best possible chance at freedom. Our group's route took us through Tennessee and Kentucky, following a chain of underground railroad safe houses, traveling mostly at night, hiding in barns and cellars and caves during the day. We used multiple cover stories depending on the situation, sometimes claiming to be free people traveling north for work, sometimes posing as servants, accompanying a white patron using forged papers, sometimes simply hiding and avoiding all contact with anyone who might report us. Each day brought new dangers and new small triumphs. There was the night we had to cross a swollen river in the dark, linking arms to avoid being swept away by the current, water up to our chests, knowing that if anyone lost their grip, we'd all be carried downstream. There was the day we hid in a hayloft while slave catchers searched the barn below, their dogs barking furiously just feet away from where we lay absolutely still. And I held my hand over Sarah's mouth because she was trying not to cough, and any sound would have meant capture or death. There was the Quaker family in Kentucky who risked everything by feeding us from their own meager supplies and giving us their children's coats because winter was approaching and we'd be traveling through cold northern states. There was the freed black man in Ohio who'd crossed back south of the border, risking his own re-enslavement to guide us for a critical stretch where patrols were heavy and the terrain was confusing. And there was the morning 6 weeks after we'd walked away from the Wallace plantation, exhausted and footsore and thinner than we'd ever been, but still alive and still free, when we crossed the border into Canada. The moment our feet touched Canadian soil, we became legally free, not fugitives, not property, not people who could be captured and returned, but human beings with legal personhood and rights that couldn't be violated. I stood there on Canadian ground, my children clinging to me, Isaiah's arm around my shoulders, and I wept for the first time since the night we'd left Alabama. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming reality of it. We were free. After 30 years of bondage, after a lifetime of being owned and controlled and reduced to property, we were free. Not just me, but my family. And not just my family, but 33 people total. Over the following weeks, I learned that all 6 groups had successfully reached Canada. Some took longer routes, some had closer calls with capture, but every single person who'd walked away from the Wallace plantation that stormy night made it to freedom. 33 for 33. A perfect success rate that was almost unheard of in underground railroad operations, where capture rates could reach 50% or higher. And back in Alabama, the consequences rippled outward exactly as I'd hoped. The financial loss devastated Wallace's operation. Cotton went unharvested because there weren't enough workers. Skilled positions remained unfilled or badly filled because the blacksmith, the carpenter, the cook, the most capable field workers, they were all gone. Wallace had to borrow heavily to purchase new enslaved workers, driving himself into dangerous debt. The plantation that had been profitable for decades began losing money, but the financial damage was nothing compared to the reputational and psychological damage. The story of the mass escape spread throughout the region and beyond. Other plantation owners began to question Wallace's competence. If 33 people could plan and execute an escape right under his nose, what did that say about his oversight? Were his remaining enslaved people also planning rebellion? Could the same thing happen on other plantations? The fear that spread through the slave-owning class was palpable. Because the most unsettling thing about our escape wasn't just that we'd achieved freedom. It was that we'd demonstrated sophisticated planning, coordination, and intelligence. We'd proven that enslaved people could organize complex operations in plain sight without their masters knowing. We'd shown that the control was more illusion than reality. And Jones became consumed by trying to understand how it had been done. He collected the quilts and the marked wood and the strange knots, spread them across his room, stared at them for hours trying to crack the code, trying to understand the language we'd used. He drove himself to exhaustion, and then beyond it, his obsession destroying his health and his career. He never figured it out, because there was no single code to crack. It was multiple overlapping systems, each meaningful only to those we'd taught, each one looking random to outside observers. And even if he'd understood the methods, he could never know the specific meanings we'd assigned to specific patterns. The quilt that meant, "Gather at the oak tree," how would he know that? The rope knots indicating midnight. How could he guess? Within a year, Wallace sold the plantation at a significant loss and retired, broken. Jones was dismissed and died a few years later, poor and forgotten. The plantation that had generated wealth for 3 generations was finished, destroyed not by violence, but by the coordinated withdrawal of the labor it depended on. And I lived to tell the story. In Canada, our group settled into a community of formerly enslaved people. Isaiah found work as a carpenter, finally able to profit from his skills. I became a teacher, using my knowledge to educate children who'd been denied education under slavery. Caleb and Sarah grew up free, attended real schools, had opportunities impossible under bondage. And I told our story carefully and strategically. Not immediately, it was still too dangerous for the people who'd helped us. But eventually, I began sharing the details of how we'd organized the escape, how we'd used quilts and trees and ropes and songs to communicate, how we'd planned for over a year, how 33 people had executed a complex operation while appearing to be nothing but ordinary field workers. The story of the smile that emptied a plantation became legend in abolitionist circles. The image of a woman smiling during a whipping because she knew freedom was hours away. Because her tormentor's power was already broken, it became a symbol of resistance, intelligence, and the triumph of planning over force. I lived in Canada for 40 years after the escape, dying in 1897 at age 70. I saw slavery legally destroyed by the Civil War, saw Reconstruction's attempts at justice, saw the long continuing struggle for true equality. But the proudest moment of my life remained that August night, when 33 people walked away from slavery toward freedom, when a year of planning culminated in perfect execution, when we proved that intelligence and organization could defeat even the most oppressive system. And the symbol remained the smile. The smile I'd given Jones during the whipping, the smile that had communicated victory before he understood there was even a battle. That smile became shorthand for the power of hidden resistance, for the intelligence of people who'd been systematically underestimated, for the certainty that oppression would eventually fall not through violence, but through the patient, careful work of people who refused to accept their condition as permanent. Esther lived until 1897, dying at age 70 in Ontario, Canada, where she'd worked as a teacher and community organizer for 4 decades. She and Isaiah remained married until his death in 1889. Their children, Caleb and Sarah, both became teachers, and their grandchildren included doctors, lawyers, and ministers. All 33 people who escaped reached Canada and survived. Their collective descendants now number in the hundreds. Mestre Wallace sold his plantation in 1859 for 60% of its pre-escape value and died in 1862. Overseer Jones was dismissed in 1858, unable to find work elsewhere, and died in poverty in 1862, reportedly still obsessed with understanding the communication system. The smile of freedom became famous in abolitionist literature, inspiring songs, poems, and artwork. The communication systems Esther developed were documented and became templates for other Underground Railroad operations. Modern historians consider the Wallace Plantation escape one of the most sophisticated, coordinated escapes in American slavery history, demonstrating advanced organizational capabilities. The specific quilt patterns, tree markings, and other signals were preserved through documentation and remain important historical records of enslaved people's resistance methods. The psychological impact of the escape, 33 people vanishing in one night, created lasting anxiety among slaveholders about the security of their operations and the reliability of their control, contributing to the broader destabilization of slavery as an institution. The whip struck her back, but her smile carried the knowledge that power had already been defeated by planning, patience, and intelligence. Esther's story isn't supernatural intervention. It's the extraordinary achievement of human minds working in coordination, of networks built in plain sight, of resistance that looked like compliance until freedom became reality. If this tale of strategic brilliance, patient organization, and the triumph of coordination over oppression has moved you, subscribe to discover more stories of enslaved people who resisted through intelligence rather than violence, who built freedom through planning rather than desperation, who proved that the most effective revolution is often the quietest one. Drop a comment from wherever you're watching, and join a community remembering that the most dangerous revolutionaries look ordinary until the moment they walk away from oppression forever.